are you still glad that you put this all out there?
Oh, I'm super glad I put it all out there. I think, you know, there's obviously a lot of noise in social media. There's a lot of people saying a whole bunch of things.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Behavioral Arts. My name is Spidey, and I use my degree in sociology and psychology, my certifications in criminal interrogation and body language analysis, and over 10 years experience as an award-winning mentalist to teach people behavioral analysis and practical psychology on stages and television shows all over the world. The Baby Reindeer saga continues as Fiona Harvey is officially suing Netflix for $170 million. Plus, the creator and writer of the show, Richard Gadd, has been making some media appearances this week, and the questions he answered, or rather chose not to answer, have been really interesting. And to top it all off, Fiona's first stalking target, Wray, also did a recent interview. And in this video, we're going to look at all these things to try to figure out what everyone's thinking and where is the actual truth. Okay, just to really quickly catch everyone up in case you're not up to date, Baby Reindeer is a massively successful recent Netflix series about a woman who's stalking an aspiring comedian. Now, the actor who plays the lead in the show is the writer of the show, and Baby Reindeer is about his own actual life. It's based on what happened to him with a real-life stalker that he had. Now, the reason I say based on is because by now it's become pretty clear that the show took quite a bit of artistic license, and some things were heavily dramatized and some things were flat out made up. Now, this wasn't always clear. A lot of viewers were misled by the fact that the first episode right in the beginning on screen says, "This is a true story," not based on, not inspired by. Furthermore, on their website, Netflix heavily promoted this as being a true story, and Netflix representatives made statements about it being a true story about a convicted stalker.
It is obviously a true story of the horrific abuse that the writer and protagonist Richard Gadd suffered at the hands of a convicted stalker.
Now, shortly after the show was released, viewers were very quickly able to identify who the real-life stalker is, and her name is Fiona Harvey. And about a month ago, she appeared on Piers Morgan to fight some of these claims and say that this show is fiction, it's not true, and a lot of these things did not happen. That interview that she did was the first analysis that we did on this channel. We looked at her body language, facial expressions, and word choice to try to determine where she was being deceptive and where she was being truthful about her history with Richard Gadd. In this video, we're going to talk about what she's suing them for and how well it lines up with the very first analysis, because a lot of things become really clear. In addition to that, the first target of her stalker behaviors did an interview with Piers Morgan. We're going to look at that as well to see how much more context it could lend to her behaviors. And finally, we're going to look at Richard Gadd, the creator of the show, who this week did some interviews on some major platforms in the US, and he had some really interesting behaviors when it came to certain questions. In fact, we're going to start with that. So we're going to start by looking at Richard Gadd and his co-star in the show, Jessica Gunning, who is a fabulous actress in Baby Reindeer, their interview on Today with Hoda and Jenna. Here it is.
With us is the star and creator, Richard Gadd, along with his co-star actress, Jessica Gunning. By the way, we feel pretty honored. This is your very first U.S. morning TV appearance, so thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I mean, talk about a crazy phenomenon. I mean, you put together this little project probably wondering if anyone would see it, and now it's like #1 all around the world. Were you surprised just by what happened here?
Yeah, I was surprised. I mean, I remember when it came out 8 a.m. UK time on a Thursday, April 11th, I think it was, and I remember thinking maybe someone might watch it the weekend, maybe I'll get a few texts, but literally the second it went out, my phone was exploding. There was so much. It felt like it was overnight that everyone was talking about it suddenly, talking about us, talking about the show.
All right, so I want to start with a really quick baseline that's going to help us not just with this interview, but with another interview that we're going to look at in a second. So in this one, you'll notice that he's sitting comfortably on the chair, and his position isn't the epitome of comfort, but it's also not the epitome of stress. So we're not seeing a whole ton of like closing up and jittering and looking down and breaking eye contact. And we're not seeing this laid back, completely open, completely comfortable either. It's somewhere in the middle. I would say it's a little bit more closed off. His hands are often together, and you'll notice that very occasionally, like we see a little bit of movement, but we're not seeing any heavy pacifying or rubbing or adapting. Pacifiers or adapters are words that are used in research to denote any motion that helps soothe us when we're stressed. Any kind of massage-like repetitive gesture. So even if his hands are together, we're not seeing a ton of that. You'll notice he has a couple of confirming gestures where he nods like this downwards as opposed to these big open nods like this, and that's just baseline for him. I don't think it's specific to this interview. I've seen him do it that way in a lot of other interviews, so I think it speaks more to his character rather to him feeling closed off or nervous in this interview. So I would describe this as comfortable, a little bit on the reserved side. Notice how when he says it felt like it was overnight, he turns and looks at Jessica, and we call this a confirmation glance. When two people are telling a story together, at key moments, they check in on each other to see if they're on the same page or if it's a shared experience. So as he says that it felt like it was overnight, he's kind of turning over to her for a second, and it's really interesting how he's the one in the middle, so it's very obvious that he's turning on to look at her to really quickly just check and see if it felt the same way to her. Let's put a pin in that. Another thing that didn't seem like much until I watched another interview is when he's telling the story of when it first came out and how he thought, maybe a few people were gonna watch it, and the next thing you know, it was this huge thing. If you look at him remembering the day it came out, you see a squint on his face, and he goes, April 11th, I believe it was, and we're seeing the brows come down, we're seeing the squint in the eyes, and this looks like he's trying to remember when it was, and he's candidly just telling the story of the first day where it was released. And it felt very natural, but I only had one little question mark about this. It's the fact that I've done quite a few TV shows. I've been part of a Netflix series as well. I have a lot of friends who have done a lot of TV shows, and I could promise you, for every single one, we are very aware of the premiere date. It is burned in our minds leading up to the date and for months after that date, because it's such an important date. And I haven't written a show entirely about my own life that was gonna be this big release. So I can guarantee you that for a while, that date was crystal clear to him. And we're talking like 2 months ago, it's not that long ago. So when I saw this genuine feeling moment of him actually trying to remember the date, I'm very aware of the fact that he would have known that date very well. So I believe that it's in this moment, in the interview, that he just needs a second to remember what that date was. And the reason this is interesting is because in a minute, we're gonna compare the behaviors in this answer to the same answer, but in a different interview. And it's really interesting to see that difference. But before we do that, let's look at the rest of this specific answer.
What was your first pinch me moment? Where you're like, people know who we are.
Yeah, first pinch me moment. I mean, there were so many. I think it almost every single time there was a pinch me moment, it would surpass itself. Like, for example, when we were like number 8 in the UK, I thought, well, this is surely it. This is as high as it goes. Right. Then it was number 1, and then number 1 in the US. And now, the biggest pinch me moments is number 1 in places like Saudi Arabia, wow, Lebanon, Qatar, all these places that I never thought would go for a show like this. So it's had this real cross-cultural effect that's,
I think what's
amazing.
Interesting about...
Okay, so he's talking about the success of the show and how it got better and better. And we're seeing some genuine stuff here, right? We're seeing his illustrators are coming to life with the hands. We're seeing the eyes really show those signs of surprise. Eyes are opening up, eyebrow flash of surprise. So we talk a lot about the research on eyebrows on the channel and how we use them conversationally to emphasize things, but we also see it in surprise. And that's what we're seeing here when he talks about the success it found in the Middle East. But what's really interesting and a great nod to Richard Gadd's capacity as a storyteller and experience as a live performer is the fact that he told the same exact story on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. And although we see less signs of him trying to recall things, we get that same type of natural flow and emotion. Take a look.
Did you imagine that it would have the impact that it's having?
No, I didn't, and not so fast as well. I remember when it went out on like 8 a.m. UK on the 11th of April, and I remember thinking maybe my mum and dad will watch it this weekend or something. But it literally felt like overnight. It just exploded. My phone was going off, my doorbell was ringing. Everyone just seemed to be discussing it. And then I kept having these points where I thought this is as big as it gets. So it got to like number 8 in the UK. I thought that's about it. Then it got to number 1. Then it was number 1 over here. Then it was number 1 in like Qatar and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia and wow, all these places I really wanted to be big in, And,
yes!
And it's crazy.
Okay, first of all, his vibe on Fallon was significantly different. So he was more relaxed, much more leaned in towards Jimmy Fallon, more comfortable. Even in the way he was answering, there was a little bit more humor, more jokes. So I feel like he really found his comfort. Now, although I'm not 100% sure which exact days these interviews were held and aired on, it certainly seems like the Fallon one was after the Today one. So he probably did the Today one that morning, and then that same night did the Fallon one. And by then, he's a little more relaxed, a little more comfortable, and he also has some answers that he's delivering a little bit more entertainingly. Notice how this time when he says the 11th of April, he doesn't say, I believe it was, or I think. He says 11th of April. So in his words, there's more confidence. In his gestures, it doesn't have that same like squint from the first time and that pause, but he is looking up and the eyebrows are coming down, and there is a little bit in his gestures suggesting that there's some thought there. So that was interesting to me because it's likely again that he did the Today interview earlier that day, so he already talked about the 11th of April. And again, this is a date that would have been so strongly engraved in his mind, especially because on Fallon, he said how excited he was for the release, and he was running around town trying to get pictures with posters. So there's a part of me wondering, like, is it just he needs a second in this interview to just retrieve that date that he knows well from memory? Or is this an experienced storyteller and stage performer using his facial expressions to pull us more into his story of the day the show was released? Either way, I thought it was interesting how in the span of less than a day, we see visibly the signs of him needing less time to remember that date, but still a little bit of time. Some other key differences in him telling the story this time is no confirmation glances with Jessica, who is again sitting next to him, but this time he's not checking in with her with, did it feel like it was overnight for her as well? We don't have that confirmation glance because they did that first interview. They probably talked about it a little. He heard her answers a little bit too. So he's more certain that they're on the same page now. So we're not seeing that confirmation glance even when he's talking about that exact same thing. Another difference is he now naturally flowed into the second part of that answer. In the Today show, it was two different questions that he answered. Now he found this rhythm for it, where he went from, the overnight success that it was, and he's adding there too a little bit. He's saying, now he's saying my doorbell was ringing. And he went from that to how it was 8th to 1st in the UK, to the 1st in the US, to the 1st in the Middle East. So he naturally flowed there. I think it's because he liked that answer, so he just found a way to present it. And now it's got a little bit more humor in it as well. Whereas in the first interview, it was like maybe a few people will watch it. Here he's saying maybe my mom and dad will watch it, which is cute, it's funny. And at the end, when he talks about the Middle Eastern countries, he goes, all the countries that I really wanted to be number one in. And that gets a laugh from the audience. So again, we're watching a seasoned stage performer here find a rhythm for telling something a certain way. And we're seeing that happen in real time. And even the body language is significantly different because in the morning show, we saw him almost reliving that surprise and saying how surprising it was for it to be hitting this number one spots. But here there's a more confident tone and we're not seeing those eyebrow flashes of being shocked or surprised. And there's even this sarcastic humor when he's saying, all these plays in the Middle East that I really wanted to be big in. So again, it's just the story's evolving and he's finding his comfort in telling this.
Qatar and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia and all these places I really wanted to be big in, Yes! And it's crazy.
There's another really important gesture that we have to talk about from the interview with Jimmy Fallon. And every time this happens, I feel the need to bring it up because it's like my moral mission. It's the biggest myth in body language. And it's crazy how often people only notice it when it lines up with the conclusions that they have. And it's going to help them drive a point home as opposed to just looking at it and going, okay, well, there are times where it's not that crystal clear. It's when he says after it was number one in the UK, it was number one over here. And we see his head doing this no gesture, exactly as he's saying it was number one over here.
Got to number one, then it was number one over here.
Now, it's unbelievable how often I'll see in comments people who will look at a video and immediately assume someone is lying only because they're doing this when they're making a statement. Just based on that one gesture. I see so many comments, oh my God, he's lying. It's a sign of lying when you do this, when you're making a statement. And that is absolutely incorrect. There isn't a single gesture that can allow you to know that somebody is being deceptive at any point, but much less this. And this is such a good example of it. When he's saying that it was number one over here in the States, does this mean like, oh my God, he's lying, it was never number one in the States? No. We do this in a lot of cases. We sometimes emphasize things like this, but we also do it when something's really hard to believe. Like he's saying it was number one in the States. I can't believe it. That's where that negation is coming from. So anytime you see someone doing this, yes, it can suggest some inner conflict, some kind of dilemma or deception in some cases, but it is a big, big stretch to every time we see that say, it only could be deception, nothing else. Okay, now we're gonna go back to the Today interview and look at one of the most important questions anyone's asked him, and his very interesting answer. But before we do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, turn those notifications on for more behavioral analysis and practical psychology content.
You know what's okay? So this is the story about someone who is stalking you, and the real life character. I mean, I was just thinking about as you were writing this. Anyone who's had a traumatic experience and is writing about it must somewhere in the back of your head say, "They'll see it."
Right.
I'm going to put it out, and they're going to watch it somewhere on some TV screen, somewhere. Did that give you hesitancy, and are you still glad that you put this all out there?
Oh, I'm super glad I put it all out there. I think, you know, there's obviously a lot of noise in social media. There's a lot of people saying a whole bunch of things. But I think at the end of the day, you can't deny just how popular this show is and how much it's touching people around the globe and the incredible sort of charity response that it's had. I mean, stalking referral rates in the UK are up 47%. Abuse referral rates are up 53%. Wow. You know, the show is having a phenomenal impact and doing a hell of a lot of good in the world. And I know there's a lot of talk and a lot of conversation online and a lot of people saying different things. I think for every single part, there's about 5 people claiming to be a part. You know, I've been sent videos, oh, this is the real life Terry. I'd never seen them before in my life. So there's a lot, the internet's always going to do its thing, but I think it all just serves as a distraction from the actual good that this show is doing.
Okay, forget body language. Seriously, we're not going to talk about body language at all in this clip because the things he's saying, the statements that he's making are overpowering any need for us to look at his body language. So let's really critically look at what just happened, right? So Hoda asked a question which is specifically about Fiona. Now, I don't know if this is because she knew what's going on with Fiona out there. I mean, she must. She's involved in the news cycle. She must know that there was talk of lawsuits and things like this. So is it because of that and she's just trying to broach the subject delicately? Or is she actually curious about his thoughts about the real stalker out there? But her question is, you know, the real stalker is out there somewhere and you know that at some point they're going to see it. So did that at any point make you nervous or did that concern you? And what he does following that question is just verbal gymnastics. He is dancing around that question and at no point does he actually address her. Because let's be honest, he's also seen or heard of at the very least what she's doing out there. The fact that she went on Piers Morgan and she said, you know, a lot of this is a lie. And he's not talking about her at all, at no point in this. So he starts with looking down as he's answering, and he's in this reflective state as he's thinking about his answer. He's trying to come up with something, and we're hearing what we call speech disfluency and verbal leaks. So he's saying, I think, you know, people obviously. So these are all things that we do to buy ourselves a bit of time to get to an actual answer.
I think, you know, there's obviously a lot of noise in social media.
It's not the first time he does this. He does this quite often with answers where he needs a second to come up with something. So that's what we're getting here. He needs a second to think of, okay, where am I going to go with this? And where does he go? He says there's a lot of noise on social media, a lot of people saying a lot of things. And I think at the end of the day, and now his eyes go up and he continues to search. So that's a lot of fluff because he's talking about people saying things on social media. Nobody asked about who's saying what on social media or, you know, what people are saying, which even he himself doesn't say. People are saying a lot of things, just very vague statement. And again, I think he's still trying to find the right path. Okay, where do we go with this? Then he focuses on the positive impact that the show's having. And this is a really interesting version of a resume or convincing statement, which is something that interrogators listen for when someone all of a sudden starts to build character randomly in an answer where it doesn't belong. And that's what this is. And it's not about necessarily himself, but his work, how the show is having a positive impact. But again, that has almost nothing to do with the question. The question was, the stalker, this person that it's about, is going to watch the show. Do you have any hesitancy when it comes to that? And he's talking about the positive impact. So what's happening psychologically is really interesting because in the way Hoda asked the question, she didn't suggest anything negative towards the situation. She didn't say, you know, were you scared that people were going to go after her or that she was going to feel targeted or attacked by people? She didn't say any of that. She just said, you know, you knew that the stalker is likely that they're going to see it, and did that make you hesitate in any way? But in his answer, it suggests that he connected somehow this topic to guilt. And I think what's happening is the moment the subject of Fiona came up here, he knows what she's facing, that she went out there and she talked about how people came after her and found her and all this stuff. So he's balancing that thought out with the good that the series did. But in so doing, he's not really answering Hoda's question. He's kind of thinking about the theme of the question and addressing it in his own way, to try to almost say to the world and to himself, you know, it's okay if there were some negative repercussions because there were a whole lot of really positive ones as well. I think this also really clarifies why in this answer twice he said that people online say all kinds of things, right? Because that had nothing to do with the question, but in his head, I think he's going to how the internet found her, the internet started writing to her, calling her out. She is now going to sue Netflix because of a lot of the feedback she got as a result of the show. So it makes perfect sense that in his head, that's where he went. People on the internet say all kinds of stuff, and maybe, she got a lot of negative attention from this, but the show has also done a lot of positive things. And I think that explains this resume statement at this point. And then at the end, he does something sneaky, because he says that for every part in the show, there's like a whole bunch of people out there that people are thinking that's who it is. Like, I'm being sent videos of Terry, and I've never met this person in my life. And that is literally what we call a straw man argument. He's arguing one thing to try to deny something else. So again, we could tell here that Fiona's in the back of his mind. And he knows that people were able to find her really quickly, and that she came out and she did an interview, and the world now knows who she is. But instead of addressing that, because in talking about that, he would have to go, yeah, there's a few things in the show that pretty much directly led to her. He's talking about a completely different character, which is Terry, and saying, yeah, all kinds of people think this is Terry and that's Terry, and I don't even know who these people are. So yeah, we did a pretty good job at hiding some of the characters. But he's completely sidetracking who the question is about. But here in talking about Terry and how well her identity has been hidden, he's inadvertently letting us know that he's very aware of the fact that Fiona's identity was not well hidden. And I wonder if he had some conversations with PR teams from Netflix before doing these interviews. I mean, he must have. They knew that the lawsuit is coming. They knew that they're in a lot of hot water because what was said about the show. So I wonder if he was given the advice like, do not talk about Fiona at any point. And despite the fact that he's not talking about her, he still has certain things in his head that he knows could have been done different. And that's what we're seeing slip through with this answer.
I wasn't worried, and I ultimately I was so fixated on just trying to make the show as good as possible, and that's what kind of took up my headspace during the writing process.
I mean, how life-changing this has been for both of you. Jessica, how has your life changed?
Well, I mean, like you say, I've been acting for 17.
The reason I wanted to show that clip is this is immediately after that question where he tried to deflect all the stuff about Fiona, and we can actually see, while they switch the conversation over to Jessica, we literally see a moment where he takes pause to kind of reset, and we see those heavy pacifiers now. So although his hands were together through a lot of this interview, we didn't see this kind of heavy massaging until this moment, and it's happening as he's pausing, taking that moment, just kind of reset, and he looks up at her and continues with the conversation. I think he's very happy that it's now moved on to her. He gets a moment here, okay, I did it, I got through that, now let's just move on. Now we're gonna move on from the Richard Gadd interviews, and we're gonna look at Piers Morgan's interview with Laura Wray, who's the first person that Fiona was accused of stalking. And Laura is a lawyer and the wife of the late Jimmy Wray, who was a Scottish member of Parliament. And she had hired Fiona to work at her law firm, and she says that Fiona stalked her and exhibited some extremely inappropriate behaviors at the workplace.
When did you know Netflix were doing a series?
Well, I found out about 5 weeks ago. The Mail on Sunday contacted me and asked me, had I seen Baby Reindeer? And I had no idea what they were talking about. So they suggested I go and watch an episode of it, which I did. And then I spoke to them, and I couldn't believe it. From the very beginning, it was obvious it was the same woman. It was Fiona Harvey. You know, the actress who does a very good job, sounds like her, looks like her, mimicked her to a T.
So quickly, just to baseline her and get an idea of what kind of communicator we're looking at here, you'll notice that she has a pretty calm, slow tone. Her illustrators aren't extravagant, right? Every now and then she'll gesture something with the hands, but it's not like she's super expressive, neither with her face, neither with her hands. You'll also notice that her blink rate is naturally quite high. right from the beginning, even in clips before this, she blinks quite a lot. Now, the normal blink rate is more or less somewhere in the 14 to 20 blinks a minute. That's a massive ballpark number. Some people blink much less, some people blink much more, and she's one of them. I don't know if she always blinks much more, but baselining is the behaviors in a specific conversation. And in this conversation, her blink rate is pretty high. But it does skyrocket, and I mean get much higher the moment she says Fiona Harvey. And a heightened blink rate is associated with stress. But the key importance of this clip is that we have someone who had previous experience here with Fiona Harvey saying that in watching the show, it was uncanny how physically, behaviorally, this was Fiona Harvey in the show. And this is just another indication that when a Netflix representative said under oath that they took every reasonable precaution to hide the identities of the characters, and on the Today interview, when Richard Gadd said that people, thought this was Terry, but he doesn't know who that person is, suggesting that they hid the identity of the characters well, it may not necessarily be true. Because here we have someone who's saying that's her. They basically recreated Fiona.
The answer phone would be full of messages, all from her, all threatening, nasty.
What kind of threats?
I'll get you, you're not going to get away with this, I'll get Jimmy Ray, all that sort of stuff. I know that sounds a bit vague, but the way it was said was in a very threatening manner.
And how many was she leaving on a daily basis?
Well, the answer phone would be filled up.
How many was that, roughly?
I'm not sure how many messages, but she would rant on. It would take probably about an hour's worth of call.
Every day?
Every day. And then when we amalgamated with the other firms, again, she did the same thing, not necessarily every day by that point. She blew a bit hot and cold, but it was pretty persistent for a couple of years. Also,
years?
Years. She did this for nearly 5 years.
So this is pretty much the best clip to sum up whether this woman's being truthful or not when she's talking about Fiona. You'll notice that we often talk on the channel about how truth tellers tell, liars sell. There doesn't seem to be a sales pitch here. At no point in this interview is trying to butter it on or convince us of anything. She's just telling the story, laying down the facts, just saying what happened. Right in the beginning, when she says that she got a bunch of messages, all from her, we see this kind of throwaway, kind of brisk nod with the head to the side like this, all from her, and then she pauses.
Full of messages, all from her.
So we could see the frustration coming out in that moment, and again we see that blink rate increase in that moment. So she's remembering those messages, and it's getting her frustrated. It's getting her worked up, remembering that part of her communications with Fiona. Another good example of how this woman just conveys the facts is that when Piers asked her, like, what kind of threatening messages did you get? This would have been an opportunity where somebody can just tweak a little, add a little, because, no one's really going to look into this. And already so many people think and know that Fiona Harvey is a stalker. So she knows that people are likely to believe it, even if she embellishes a little, but she doesn't. She goes, I'll get you. You're not going to get away with this. She even says immediately after, I know it sounds a bit vague, but the way it was said was in a very threatening manner. And as she says it sounds vague, we see a shrug. Both shoulders shrug like this. Now, this isn't something she does very often, so I noticed it. And there's a ton of great research on shrugging by Camille Debras. And shrugging could involve a lot of body parts. It could be the shoulders, hands and shoulders, eyebrows, sometimes a head tilt. But all forms of shrug denote a disengagement. Basically, I don't something. And there's something called an attitudinal shrug, which often means incapacity. Like, I don't have that. I don't know what to tell you. So here it could very well be that, like, I don't have anything more than that, but, it was threatening. It was enough. And this coming from a lawyer, like, these are the facts, and I know it sounds vague, but there was more to it than that.
Have Netflix made any attempt to approach you?
Well, their solicitors spoke to me. They contacted somebody through the Mail on Sunday, who then contacted me and asked me would I speak to their lawyers. So I had a conversation with them, and really what they wanted from me was a copy of the interim.
And when was this?
About a week ago I spoke to them.
A week ago, but you hadn't heard from them before that?
I hadn't heard from them before that. Certainly nobody approached me to say there's going to be a story coming out in which it will be very obvious that you are one of the victims.
Do you think from that it would be correct to assume they may be panicking a bit, Netflix, about the fallout from all this?
Well, I really don't know. I can't speak.
It seems very odd to me they've asked you for documentary evidence to support something which is a major plank of their series.
Yeah.
Oof. That's an important one. Not because of the behaviors, but because of what's being said. Because she said that Netflix only reached out to her recently. And I think I agree with what Piers is suggesting here, which is that they put out the series, they didn't reach out to her, and now that they're in hot water because a representative went in front of Parliament and said under oath that Fiona Harvey is a convicted stalker, I think now they're reaching out to her to see, okay, what was the extent of that, and is it excusable that we would have called her a convicted stalker? Did you take any kind of legal action? So I think there might be a little bit of that as they're trying to build some kind of defense, and they're trying to figure out if there's any world in which it's okay for them to have said that.
But it says that she was convicted, for example, for 4.5 years for what she did to you and your family.
Well, she wasn't convicted for that. I didn't press any kind of criminal charges.
So that is untrue.
So that's untrue.
I mean, again, back to Netflix's duty of care, they're making it very easy for both Fiona Harvey and you to be quickly identified.
Yeah.
And yet a material fact that she was sent to prison for 4.5 years for harassing you and your family, like it appears the same thing that Richard Gadd is saying about what happened to him, but neither of those things may be true.
Well, it doesn't appear they are true.
Okay, so now we have Laura Wray saying that in her dealings with Fiona Harvey, there was never a conviction. There's also a recent interview that came out in the last few weeks where Richard Gadd mentioned that she was never convicted in his situation either. Therefore, the court scene in the show was made up. So a lot of things are coming to light that were big questions or big uncertainties during our initial analysis of just Fiona Harvey talking to Piers Morgan. And to add to that, we now have the official lawsuit, her official complaint. And as we look at it and compare it to the initial analysis, it's crazy. The parallels that we see in where her real problems were and her behaviors in that analysis. And I think this has ended up being one of the best subjects we've looked at on the channel because at first when we did just that interview, pretty much all we had were behaviors. It was her talking. Now, a lot more stuff have come out. We have this complaint and we can compare to those behaviors. And I think there are a couple of really good reasons to go back and look at that initial analysis and compare it to the lawsuit that we're going to look at now. One reason is you realize just how some of her behaviors absolutely gave her away. And without needing to see all this, weeks ago, you could tell where her priorities were based on behavior. But secondly, it's rare that we get almost all the answers to a subject. And when that happens, we can go back and it's more reliable, right? Because if we know the answer, okay, this was for sure a lie, this was for sure more truthful, it allows us to more reliably look at those behaviors and go, okay, this is what it looks like when her stress is going up. This is what it looks like when she's trying to admit something. And we're more confident in that because we know the truth. So let's look at some of the points in this complaint. So first and foremost, in her interview, she had said that she's getting threats and nasty messages, and they've included that in the complaint, and that is confirmed. So she's getting a whole bunch of nasty messages or just spam messages, including one that is quite threatening. Now, a lot of lawyers on YouTube and some of the ones that I've spoken to have said that this does have quite a bit of weight because if people were easily able to identify her because of the show and then go and write things like this, then it's really not a great look for Netflix. But this thing gets really interesting as soon as we go into the defamation section. So the first thing they talk about in the defamation section is Harvey has never been convicted of a crime. So she said that, her lawyers looked into it, they did background checks, she's never been convicted of a crime. And this for me, I gotta be honest, was a big moment of relief because for those of you who watched the initial analysis, I said that in her behaviors, there were a lot of segments where it seemed like she was being deceptive, holding something back, but when she denied going to court or ever going to jail, it was a very clean denial. And I was very nervous when I said that at the time because I knew that a lot of people were on the she lies about everything train. And even in my comments, I got people saying, oh my God, I can't believe she got you. Of course she's been convicted. There have been family members of her online who have confirmed that she was convicted. And all these people who were really strongly convinced that of course she was convicted and she's lying. And I was sitting there very aware of the fact that people could get very polarized saying that, look, she was deceptive about a lot of things, but when it comes to this one thing, I don't think she's being deceptive. And I was almost getting ready that if that was wrong to just take mountains of criticism. But it's a relief to see that Laura Wray said she was never convicted. Richard Gadd has said she wasn't convicted, and they're suing for that, and it's the first thing in defamation. So that's good. The next part under defamation in the complaint is that she never assaulted him. So this is referencing the scene where they were in an alley and she grabbed him. And again, in the initial analysis, there was a part where she was really badly denying something. I think it was the voicemails. And she said something like, and even if those were true, even if that was true, I was never convicted. I never lunged at him across the bar. I never assaulted him in the alley. Something along those lines.
I mean, my point is, though, even if that were true, I didn't lunge at him across the bar. I didn't assault him in a canal. I didn't go to jail.
And we talked about in the analysis how she literally just showed her hand, where she had this really weak denial with the voice messages. And she herself said, even if those are true about something she was denying, these things aren't. She brought it back to these topics. And I said in the analysis, she's literally telling us which parts were made up and which parts were true. And it turns out, at the very least, that this is something that they're going to be fighting, that was made up. Next, they're talking about how she was never a stalker. And stalker is, I guess, a subjective term. Here they're focusing on the part where he said, I had a convicted stalker stalking me. So we're going back to focusing on that. And then about how she waited outside where he was living and stalking him like that. And she didn't really talk about that in the Piers Morgan interview, but it seems like she's suggesting here that that didn't happen. And then we have literally the only other thing that she herself went to in that interview and saying it wasn't true. And it's a scene where she lunged at him across the bar and physically attacked him. And at the time I'd said that her behaviors are indicating that she's refocusing to these things because those things are probably legitimately not true, and it seems that that's what's going on. Next, they talk about the exact two sources that I talked about in the second analysis video when I brought in Alita from Legal Bites to talk about the legal aspect of this. And we talked about how there was a representative from Netflix who went in front of Parliament and called her a convicted stalker, and how this might represent a problem, but also on their website, Tadam, where they continuously said that this was a true story. And this is an interesting one because there's been a lot of back and forth, right? A lot of people saying, yeah, well, this is a true story in the beginning of the first episode was typed, so it's the character typing it. And at the end of the episode, past the credits, there's a disclaimer. Then there's other people saying, yeah, but not everyone's gonna put that amount of thought into it. Not everyone stays till the end of the credits. So a lot of people are gonna go by what they saw on the screen. But to top that all off, there's an actual article on the Netflix website that stands by the fact that it's a true story. So yeah, a lot of back and forth with this one, and I guess it's gonna come down to the lawyers in court being able to prove that a reasonable person might believe that Netflix was representing this as a true story. So besides the things that are in this complaint, something that's barely mentioned, if at all, I didn't see it anywhere, but there's certainly no focus on it at all, is the emails, tweets, and voice messages. Nowhere here in the defamation does it say that they claimed I left them a bunch of voice messages. That's not the case. And this is something that she denied in that interview, but in the behaviors, we talked about how it's not a firm denial. It's not a confident denial. There's a lot that was suggesting that she's very unconfident about that, and she was even trying to move away from it. So I think at the end of the day, the whole thing has become very clear to me. This is a stalker who has very disturbing habits and behaviors, who did some unacceptable things to both Laura Wray and Richard Gadd. I think a lot of what's being said about her character is accurate. But on the other hand, I do think that Netflix did not conceal her identity well, said some things about her that weren't true, and went on to suggest that those things were in fact true when they weren't. In addition to this, Richard Gadd has admitted to having some fault in the relationship in that he entertained it, but I also think that there would have been opportunities for him to come out earlier and say, look, this part was made up, especially because he's seen the interview, he knows she's out there, she's saying that she's getting all this negativity, and yeah, you can argue that it's merited because she did a whole bunch of messed up stuff, but at the very least, clarify what things she actually did and what things she didn't do. That way, she'll get the hate for things that she actually did do. Anyways, this is shaping up to be a really interesting lawsuit. I'll keep an eye on it, but I'm really excited about the fact that in that initial analysis, way before any of this came out, anyone did due diligence, anybody came out and made clarifying statements, her behaviors very accurately pointed to pretty much exactly what we're seeing in this lawsuit. And I kind of giggled because Piers Morgan was bringing all these guests and telling them and trying to figure it out. And oh, what happened? We need to do this. We got to look into it. Background search this. But weeks before, just looking at her interview, there were some very good indications of exactly where the truths and the lies were. But I'm really interested in getting your thoughts on this one. We've been having some great conversations in the other two analysis videos. But what do you think is going to happen here? Like, do you think that Netflix will be able to defend that, you know, they made it very clear that this was fiction and that they covered themselves well and they hid her identity well? Or is it pretty clear that they were pretty irresponsible with hiding the identity and making some claims that were exaggerated, maybe for drama, maybe for views? I don't know. What do you think is going to happen here? I'd love to get your thoughts. Let me know in the comments and I'll see you on the next one.